courtroom was packed that morning. People waited their turn for minor cases, parking tickets, small fines, and a few traffic violations. The air inside was heavy with murmurs and the shuffling of papers. A few officers stood near the front looking bored, chatting quietly while others sat tapping on their phones. Among them sat a woman who didn't look like she belonged there. She was quiet, her posture straight but humble, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't dressed fancy, just a simple blouse and slacks, her hair tied back neatly. She seemed calm, though her eyes showed a trace of tiredness. No one really noticed her at first. To most people in the room, she looked like any ordinary woman, someone who had probably made a small mistake and just wanted to get it over with. When her name was called, she stood up gently, almost nervously. She didn't look at anyone. She just walked toward the front where the judge sat, her steps soft but steady. Across the room, the officer who had written her ticket straightened his posture. He was a tall man with a proud look, the kind who liked to be in charge. His name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he crossed his arms, waiting for his moment to speak. The judge looked at the file. "You are here for a citation of reckless driving," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Officer Daniels, you issued this ticket?" "Yes, Your Honor," the officer replied quickly, already smirking a little. "I pulled her over last week. She was going well above the speed limit on Route 9. Didn't seem too worried about it either." The woman looked down for a second, taking a slow breath. The judge turned to her. "Ma'am, is that correct? Were you speeding?" She spoke softly, her voice gentle but clear. "Yes, Your Honor. I may have been a little over the limit, but it wasn't intentional. I was on my way to a hospital appointment." "A hospital appointment?" The judge repeated. "Yes, sir," she nodded. "At the Veterans Hospital. I had a checkup that morning. I must have been running late." Before the judge could respond, Officer Daniels let out a short laugh. "Veterans Hospital, huh?" he said with a grin. "You a doctor or something?" There was a quiet chuckle from someone in the back. The woman didn't answer right away. She just looked down again, her fingers tightening slightly around the papers she held. The judge frowned a little. "Officer, let's keep it professional, please." "Of course, Your Honor," the officer said quickly, though the smirk never left his face. "It's just that I hear that excuse a lot. Everyone's got some kind of emergency when they're caught speeding." The woman stayed silent. She didn't argue or raise her voice. There was something about her calmness that made her stand out. Even the judge seemed to notice. "Ma'am," he said gently, "can you tell me exactly what happened?" She nodded slowly. "I was coming from my home, sir. I had an appointment at 8:30 that morning at the Veterans Hospital." "It's part of my routine visits." "Routine visits?" the judge asked. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I have to go in every few months." Officer Daniels let out another small laugh under his breath. "You don't look like a veteran to me," he muttered. This time a few heads turned. The judge gave him a sharp look, but before he could speak, the officer continued. "No disrespect, Your Honor, but come on. She looks more like a teacher or an office worker. I mean, veterans usually, well, you can tell who they are." The courtroom went a little quiet. Even those who had been busy looking at their phones now watched. The woman slowly lifted her eyes toward the officer. She didn't look angry, just disappointed, maybe even hurt. "I'm sorry I don't fit your picture of a veteran," she said softly. Her voice wasn't trembling, but it carried a quiet strength. The officer shrugged, still smiling. "Didn't mean anything by it," he said quickly. "Just saying." The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly irritated by the tone. "Officer Daniels, that's enough," he said sternly. "You're here to present facts, not opinions." The officer nodded, though it was clear he wasn't sorry. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge turned back to the woman. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation of your appointment?" "Yes, sir," she said. She carefully opened a folder she'd brought with her and took out a small paper slip, the kind of document that listed her appointment details. The judge took it, adjusted his glasses, and read quietly. Then he nodded. "This looks valid." The officer leaned a bit, trying to peek at the paper. "Probably printed that online," he muttered. The judge looked up sharply. "Officer Daniels!" "Sorry, Your Honor," he said quickly again. Though his smirk was fading, the woman stayed calm through it all. She didn't try to defend herself or argue. Her posture remained straight, her tone respectful. The judge sighed, setting the paper down. "This seems straightforward," he said. "But I'd like to know a bit more. You said you go to the Veterans Hospital regularly. Can I ask why?" The woman nodded again. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "I've been under treatment there for a while." Officer Daniels crossed his arms again, a skeptical look on his face. "What kind of treatment?" he said, almost like he didn't believe her. The judge shot him another warning glance, but the woman answered anyway. "Physical therapy and follow-ups," she said. "From an injury." "An injury?" the officer repeated. "From what?" She hesitated, then said simply, "From my time in service." The words hung in the air for a moment. The judge leaned forward. "Service?" "Yes, sir," she said. "I served for almost 8 years." The officer blinked. "You mean, like the army?" She nodded quietly. There was a brief silence. Even the people waiting for their cases seemed to stop moving. The officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable now, but he still looked doubtful. "Well," he said with a nervous chuckle, "I guess that explains the hospital. Still doesn't explain the speeding." A few people in the courtroom shook their heads at his tone. One older man whispered, "Unbelievable." The judge didn't say much right away. He studied the woman for a moment, then glanced at the officer. It was clear he wasn't impressed with how the officer had handled himself. "All right," the judge finally said. "Let's take a short break before I make a decision." "Ma'am, please remain seated." The woman nodded politely and returned to her seat. As she passed the officer, he gave her a small half-smile, like he thought he'd already won. But she didn't react. She just sat down quietly, her face calm and unreadable. When the judge left the room, a few people began whispering again. Someone in the back said, "She said she was in the army?" Another replied, "No way, she doesn't look like it." The woman heard them, but she didn't respond. She simply folded her hands again, her eyes focused on the floor. There was a stillness about her, a kind of patience that didn't need words. The officer, meanwhile, walked over to one of his colleagues near the door. "Can you believe that?" he said in a low voice, chuckling. "Says she's a veteran. Probably served lunch at the base cafeteria." His friend laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Man, you shouldn't say that out loud." "Relax," the officer said. "She's harmless." But the truth was, the woman sitting a few feet away wasn't harmless at all. She had faced things most people in that room could never imagine. She had seen danger, loss, and fear, and yet here she was, calm, polite, and patient while being judged by people who knew nothing about her. What no one realized yet was that in just a few moments, the entire courtroom, including Officer Daniels, was about to learn exactly who she was and why mocking her had been a mistake he would never forget. She looked up at the clock quietly. The minute hand ticked slowly toward the next hour. She knew what she carried in that folder wasn't just papers. It was her life story, proof of everything she had been through. She didn't want to use it to prove anyone wrong. But sometimes life forces you to stand up, not for pride, but for truth. The chatter around her faded as the door behind the bench opened again. The judge was coming back. The officer straightened his posture again, unaware that this next part would completely change the tone of the day, and his opinion forever. And with that, the room fell silent once more. As the judge returned to the bench, the murmurs in the room slowly died down. People returned to their seats and the courtroom became tense again, everyone waiting for what would come next. The woman remained sitting calmly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on the front of the room. There was a quiet confidence in her posture, something that seemed to say she was ready for whatever happened. Officer Daniels, however, still seemed unfazed. He leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk still hanging on his face. It wasn't as bold as before, but it was there, almost like he was daring someone to challenge him. He didn't believe she was really a veteran, and that belief had stuck with him. To him, she still seemed like just another person who had made up a story to get out of a ticket. The judge sat back down, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. "All right, we'll resume," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I've reviewed the information presented so far. Ma'am, I'd like to ask you a few more questions before we proceed." The woman nodded politely. Officer Daniels shifted slightly. He looked at his watch, clearly disinterested, like he'd already made up his mind about the whole thing. The judge looked over at the woman, his expression softening slightly. "I understand you've served in the military. Could you tell me a little about your service?" She hesitated for just a moment, then spoke softly. "I enlisted when I was 20. I served for nearly 8 years in the Army. I was stationed overseas in a combat zone for several of those years. The room went quiet. People had begun to pay more attention, realizing that this was no ordinary traffic case. Officer Daniels looked at her, still with doubt in his eyes, but his expression had changed slightly. He no longer seemed quite as sure of himself. The judge's tone was respectful as he asked, "And what role did you have during your service?" "I was a medic," she said simply, her voice unwavering. "I worked with my unit, providing medical support during operations. It wasn't always easy, but it was my job to keep my fellow soldiers safe and to treat the wounded." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes shifting between the woman and Officer Daniels. He could tell that something wasn't right with the officer's attitude, and he wasn't pleased about it. He turned back to the woman. "Do you have any documentation that could confirm your service?" The woman reached into her folder once more and pulled out a set of official papers. She handed them over to the judge without hesitation. Officer Daniels, however, wasn't ready to give up. He leaned forward, clearly wanting to make his point. "I mean, I've seen all kinds of paperwork before," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Anyone can print out a certificate or a letter online. Doesn't mean they're telling the truth." The judge shot him a sharp glance, his patience wearing thin. "That's enough, officer," he said firmly. "We are not here to question someone's honor or integrity without cause. If you have something to add, speak to the facts. Otherwise, please remain silent." There was a brief pause. Officer Daniels closed his mouth, his face reddening. He hadn't expected that response. The woman, on the other hand, hadn't reacted. She simply watched the exchange quietly. The judge looked over the papers the woman had provided, his eyes scanning the details. "These appear to be in order," he said. "They confirm your service in the military and your role as a combat medic." He glanced at the officer. "Is there any reason to doubt their validity?" Officer Daniels opened his mouth, then hesitated. The truth was, there was no real reason to question her service, but he didn't want to admit it. No, Your Honor," he said reluctantly. The judge gave him a pointed look but turned back to the woman. "Ma'am, I appreciate your patience. I understand that serving in the military is not an easy path, but I also recognize that everyone in this room is trying to do their job, and that sometimes misunderstandings happen. I believe this was one of those situations." She nodded once more. "I understand, sir. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just want to explain what happened." Officer Daniels stood still, his arms still crossed, but now there was a slight tension in his posture. He didn't seem quite as confident as before, and for the first time, doubt began to creep into his mind. He had been so certain that the woman in front of him was just another person trying to get out of a ticket. But now, seeing her calm demeanor and the documents she provided, he started to wonder if maybe he had made a mistake, but he didn't admit it. Not yet. The judge looked at him one more time, then turned his attention back to the woman. "Based on the information I have, I'm going to dismiss this ticket. You've shown sufficient proof of your appointment and your service. This will not go on your record." There was a moment of silence in the courtroom. The tension that had hung in the air seemed to evaporate as the words sunk in. The woman's shoulders relaxed, her hands unclasped as she breathed out softly. The weight of the situation had lifted, but there was something more beneath the surface. She hadn't just been fighting a traffic ticket. She had been fighting against the assumption that people like her, people who had served, sacrificed, and seen things most others couldn't even imagine, were invisible to the world. Officer Daniels, however, wasn't done yet. He still had that feeling in his gut that something wasn't right. He hadn't gotten the apology he thought he deserved. After all, he had been the one to write the ticket, and now the whole room was looking at him like he had done something wrong. The idea that he had misjudged the situation, that he had mocked her when she was telling the truth, bothered him more than he was willing to admit. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. The judge nodded at the woman, signaling that she was free to go. "I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am. You're dismissed." The woman stood up, her movements slow but graceful. She walked calmly to the door, her expression composed, though her eyes held a certain quiet strength. As she passed Officer Daniels, he couldn't help himself. He opened his mouth, but this time his voice was softer, almost hesitant. I just want to say," he started, trailing off. He didn't know how to finish the sentence. He wanted to apologize, but the words felt stuck in his throat. The woman didn't stop. She just glanced at him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "It's okay," she said quietly. "We all make mistakes." And with that, she walked out of the courtroom. Officer Daniels stood there for a moment, his mouth still open. He watched her leave, a flood of thoughts racing through his mind. The doubt he had pushed away earlier now returned full force. He had mocked her, questioned her integrity, and assumed she was just like everyone else who tried to get out of a ticket. But she wasn't like everyone else. She was a woman who had fought for her country, a woman who had been in the thick of things that most people couldn't even begin to understand, and he had missed all of that. The room was quiet again, and Officer Daniels felt the weight of the silence settle over him. He realized in that moment that he had learned something he hadn't expected today. He had learned what it felt like to be humbled, and more importantly, what it meant to truly respect someone, not because of their uniform, but because of their actions. As the door to the courtroom closed behind the woman, Officer Daniels stood there, his thoughts racing. He knew it wasn't enough to just say the words. He needed to do more. He needed to learn from his mistake. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop judging people by what they looked like and start seeing them for who they really were. The courtroom door closed softly behind her. Officer Daniels stood frozen in place for a moment, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the woman had been. He felt a mix of emotions he wasn't used to: confusion, embarrassment, and even a little bit of shame. As the sounds of the courtroom resumed around him, the officer found himself unable to shake the weight of what had just happened. He had been so sure. At first, when he wrote the ticket and saw her standing there, she seemed like just another case. He'd seen it 1,000 times before, people who thought they could talk their way out of a fine by telling some sad story. But this time was different, and he had missed it. His mind kept replaying the woman's calm words, the way she had stood there so composed, as though she wasn't rattled by the officer's doubts. It had almost been like she was waiting for something, maybe for him to finally understand. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. He wasn't used to feeling this way. Officer Daniels had spent years working the beat, had dealt with people from all walks of life. He'd seen it all: drivers who were rude, aggressive, and entitled. He had been trained to spot the fakes, to know who was lying and who wasn't. It was a skill that had served him well, but in this case his instincts had failed him. After a few minutes, Daniels shook his head and muttered under his breath, "What was I thinking?" He turned and walked back to the officer's desk, his mind still spinning. He knew he couldn't let it go. Not this time. Meanwhile, the woman, who had quietly walked out of the courtroom, wasn't thinking about Officer Daniels or the case. She had been through much worse in her life, after all. The whole scene had bothered her, yes, but it wasn't unexpected. She had lived through enough to know that some people wouldn't always see her the way she saw herself. She knew that when people looked at her, they didn't always see a soldier, let alone a decorated one. They saw what they wanted to see: someone who looked young, maybe even a little out of place in her stiff, formal clothes. It didn't matter that she had spent years in war zones, working tirelessly to save lives under some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. She had learned a long time ago that people would judge her based on the outside, and that was something she couldn't control. As she walked out to her car, the soft morning sunlight bathed the streets, but there was no warmth in it for her. She wasn't upset, though. She had gotten used to this. The thing that really bothered her wasn't Officer Daniels' mockery. It was the fact that people too often forgot to look beyond the surface. It wasn't just the officer, but society at large. So many people only saw what they wanted to see. The uniform didn't matter. The medals didn't matter. The experience didn't matter. It wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of situation, but she wasn't going to let it get to her. She was stronger than that. Besides, she had more important things to focus on. The Veterans Hospital was her priority today, and there were people there who actually needed her. Back in the courtroom, Daniels was still pacing. He was trying to figure out what he should do next. How could he make it right? It wasn't just about the ticket anymore. It was about everything he had said, everything he had assumed. He had mocked her. He had belittled her, and she hadn't even flinched. He thought back to the way she had handled herself. Most people, when confronted with someone questioning their integrity, would have been defensive, maybe even angry. But she had stayed calm. She had stayed respectful. She hadn't tried to prove herself to him. She had let her actions speak for her. And now Daniels was starting to feel like a fool for not recognizing that sooner. He rubbed his forehead, still annoyed with himself. He needed to apologize, but how? He couldn't just walk up to her and say, "I'm sorry." No, it needed to be more than that. He knew that now. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind him. "Officer Daniels?" He turned around to find his colleague, another officer from the department, standing there with a slightly puzzled look on his face. "You okay, man? You seem off today." Daniels sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I messed up, that's what's wrong." The colleague raised an eyebrow. "Messed up? What do you mean?" "I gave that woman a hard time in the courtroom," Daniels admitted, his voice low. "She didn't deserve it. I mocked her, didn't believe her. I thought she was just some woman trying to get out of a ticket, but she was telling the truth the whole time." His colleague looked surprised. "What, the woman who was just here?" "Yeah," Daniels replied. "She served in the military. She's a decorated combat medic. She'd been overseas in dangerous zones risking her life, and I treated her like she was lying about the whole thing." His colleague shook his head, understanding dawning on him. "Man, that's rough. But hey, everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is you realize it." Daniels nodded slowly, but there was still a tightness in his chest. "It's not just about the mistake. It's about the way I treated her. I mocked her service, made jokes at her expense. I shouldn't have done that." There was a pause as Daniels' colleague processed what he was hearing. "So what are you going to do?" "I have to apologize," Daniels said firmly. "But I want to do more than just say I'm sorry. I want to make sure she knows that I truly respect what she's done, not just as a soldier, but as a person." His colleague patted him on the back. "Well, it sounds like you're on the right track. It's never easy to admit when you're wrong, but you're doing the right thing now. That counts for something." Daniels was quiet for a moment, reflecting on those words. His colleague was right. It was never easy to admit when you were wrong, especially when it came to something as serious as this. But now that he knew the truth, now that he understood who she really was, he couldn't just walk away without trying to make amends. After a deep breath, Daniels walked toward the exit. He knew where she had gone. The Veterans Hospital wasn't far from the courthouse, and if he was lucky, he might catch her before she left. As he made his way out into the sunlight, he thought about what he would say. He knew it couldn't be just any apology. He had to show her that he was sincere, that he understood the gravity of his mistake. His footsteps quickened as he approached his car. This wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to face it. For the first time, he wasn't just thinking about the job in front of him. He was thinking about what it meant to truly respect someone, about what it meant to be a man of integrity, and he knew he had to start by making things right with her. Officer. Daniels had always prided himself on being a man of action. He was someone who didn't waste time when there was a job to do. But right now, as he sat in his patrol car, staring at the entrance to the Veterans Hospital, he felt something he wasn't used to: nervousness. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been unsure of his next move, but this situation felt different. He had made a mistake, a big one, and he was about to face the person he'd wronged. He took a deep breath and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. "Get it together," he muttered under his breath. He had to go inside. He had to apologize. There was no other choice. The hospital was quiet, the kind of peaceful place that made you feel like time slowed down once you stepped through the doors. It was filled with reminders of service and sacrifice, photos of soldiers, plaques honoring those who had served, and murals depicting the bravery of military personnel. Daniels walked past the walls, his boots echoing on the tile floors. He didn't know exactly where to find her, but he figured he would ask at the front desk. He approached the receptionist, who greeted him with a polite smile. "Can I help you, officer?" Yeah," Daniels started, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm looking for a woman who was here earlier today. She was a soldier. I need to speak with her." The receptionist nodded thoughtfully. "You're probably talking about the medic who came in this morning. Let me check for you." She typed quickly on her keyboard and glanced up at Daniels. "She's in the rehab wing, room 214. You can take the elevator up to the second floor." Daniels thanked her and made his way to the elevator. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but something about the quiet halls of the hospital made everything feel more serious. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It wasn't even about his job. This was about something deeper, about respect, dignity, and the way people like the woman he had wronged had earned their place in the world. The elevator doors opened, and Daniel stepped out into a long corridor. The walls here were lined with pictures of veterans, some with smiling faces, others with serious looks that spoke of experiences only they could understand. As he walked down the hall, Daniels found himself thinking about what had happened earlier that day. He had been so quick to dismiss her, to mock her and assume she was just another person trying to get out of a fine. He hadn't taken the time to really see her, to understand her, and now he regretted it. Room 214 was at the end of the hall. Daniel stopped in front of the door, his heart pounding. He had rehearsed what he would say 100 times in his head, but now, as he stood there, the words seemed to vanish. He knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," came a soft voice from inside. Daniels pushed the door open, and there she was, sitting in a chair by the window, looking out over the hospital grounds. Her uniform was gone, replaced by a simple hospital gown, but she still carried herself with the same quiet strength he had seen earlier. She turned her head when he walked in, her eyes meeting his, but there was no sign of surprise or hostility in them. She just looked at him, calm, composed, like she had been expecting him. For a moment, Daniels didn't know what to say. He stood in the doorway, feeling like a fool. She hadn't asked for this apology. She hadn't demanded anything. But he couldn't just leave without saying something. I owe you an apology," Daniels finally said, his voice sounding almost too loud in the quiet room. The woman didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, as though she had been waiting for him to come to this moment. "I treated you badly earlier," Daniels continued, his words tumbling out. "I mocked you. I doubted you. And I shouldn't have. I didn't see who you really are." She stayed silent, her gaze steady. "I made assumptions about you based on nothing but my own arrogance," he said, swallowing hard. "I thought you were just another person trying to get out of a ticket. But you weren't. I was wrong, and I need you to know that I see that now. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm sorry for how I treated you." There was a long pause before she finally spoke. "You're not the first person to make assumptions about me," she said quietly, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made Daniels feel even more guilty. "You're not the first person to doubt my service or question what I've been through." Daniels felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "I can't imagine what that must feel like." The woman looked out the window for a moment, then turned back to him. "It's not easy. People see a woman like me, someone who doesn't fit their idea of a soldier, and they think I'm weak or I'm pretending. They don't know what I've done, what I've been through. They don't see the sacrifices, and that's what hurts the most." Daniels felt his heart ache. He had always respected the military, always understood that soldiers gave everything for their country. But hearing her speak about the way people judged her, the way she had to constantly prove herself, hit him harder than he expected. "I don't think you're weak," he said softly. "I never thought that. I was just too quick to judge, too quick to believe the worst." She nodded slowly, accepting his words without any bitterness. "That's the thing, though. People like me, we're used to it. It's not the first time I've had to prove myself to someone. It probably won't be the last." Daniel stepped closer to her, his voice filled with sincerity. "I wish I'd taken the time to see that before. To really see who you are and what you've done. I was wrong, and I want you to know that I respect you more than I can say." She finally smiled, a small, knowing smile. "I appreciate that, and I forgive you. But the truth is, you'll never understand what it's like unless you've been there, unless you've put your life on the line for someone else, and not everyone has that kind of courage." Daniels took a deep breath, his chest tightening with emotion. He hadn't been expecting her forgiveness, but it was more than just words. It was the kind of understanding he didn't often find. She wasn't just forgiving him for his mistake. She was teaching him something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You're right," he said softly. "I'll never fully understand. But I'm learning, and I'm trying to be better." The woman gave him another nod, this one more like a quiet acknowledgement of his effort. That's all anyone can do. Daniel stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of her words. He had come here to apologize, but somehow, he felt like he had walked away with more than he had expected. Before he turned to leave, he looked back at her. "I'll never forget this, you know. What you've taught me today. Thank you." She didn't respond right away, but there was a light in her eyes that told him she understood. "Take care of yourself, officer," she said quietly, her voice softer now. "And remember, it's never too late to learn." Daniel smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't expected. "I won't forget." As he walked out of the room, the door closing behind him, he felt lighter somehow. He had come here with the intention of apologizing, but in the end, it was her who had given him something far more valuable. A lesson in humility, respect, and the strength of those who have served. He couldn't undo the past, but he could make sure that from this day forward, he would always take the time to see people for who they really were, beyond the surface, beyond the assumptions, and beyond the judgments. And that, he realized, was the real lesson he needed to learn. The next few days after Daniel's visit to the hospital were different. There was a shift in the way he saw things. It wasn't just the job that had changed. He had changed. The events of that day, the conversation he had with the woman, and the realization of his own mistakes lingered in his mind, giving him a new perspective on life and people. It wasn't something he could shake off quickly. At first, it was hard to pinpoint what had exactly shifted. It wasn't that he had suddenly become a different person, but something about the way he interacted with others felt more thoughtful, more intentional. Every time he stopped someone for a traffic violation or gave out a ticket, he couldn't help but ask himself, who is this person? What's their story? He had spent years doing his job in a routine way, almost robotic in his interactions with people, but now, he found himself wondering about the lives behind the violations. One morning, while he was sitting in his patrol car during a break, he pulled out his phone and found a news article about veterans support. The headline caught his attention. Hidden Heroes, the untold stories of those who serve. And for the first time in a long time, he clicked on it. As he read through the article, he learned more about the sacrifices, the struggles, and the mental health challenges that soldiers faced long after their service ended. He read about the things he'd never truly understood before, about soldiers who came back home but didn't come back whole, about the invisible wounds they carried with them, and the way society sometimes pushed them aside, forgetting all they had given. Daniels felt a lump form in his throat as he read. It was like a whole new world was opening up to him, one he hadn't really taken the time to see. Later that day, he found himself pulled over on the side of the road. A car had broken down and the driver was a young man looking flustered and frustrated. Without thinking, Daniels got out of his car and walked toward him. Normally, he might have just asked if the driver needed help, maybe given him a ticket for the hazard lights not working properly, and moved on. But today was different. "Everything okay?" Daniels asked as he approached. The man looked up, surprised by the officer's genuine tone. Yeah, just a flat tire," the driver said. "I don't know what to do. I'm stuck here." Daniels smiled softly. "Well, first things first. Let me make sure you're safe." He went back to his patrol car, grabbed his safety cones, and set them up around the broken-down vehicle. After making sure everything was secure, he walked back to the driver. "Got a spare?" Daniels asked. The man nodded but seemed unsure. "I think so. I've never changed a tire before, honestly." Daniels chuckled. "Not a problem. Let me show you how it's done." As he worked, he talked to the young man about life, about how everyone has their moments of struggle, and about how it's okay to ask for help. It was a small moment, but it was one that felt different from all the others. It wasn't about authority or rules, it was about being human. It was about helping someone who needed it. When the tire was changed and the car was ready to go, the young man looked at Daniels with gratitude in his eyes. "I really appreciate it, officer. I didn't think I'd be able to get it done myself." Daniels gave him a warm smile. "Don't mention it. Just pay it forward when you get the chance, all right?" As the car drove away, Daniels stood there for a moment, watching it disappear down the road. For the first time in a long while, he felt good about his day. Not because he had done something extraordinary, but because he had taken the time to care. The next few weeks continued in the same way. Daniels began to realize that his life, the job, and the people he interacted with weren't just part of a routine anymore. They were real, complex individuals with stories that mattered. He started to see the veterans he passed by on the street, not as people who had simply done their duty, but as human beings who had given everything and deserved respect and dignity. He saw the way they walked, sometimes a little slower than others, sometimes with a faraway look in their eyes. But he didn't just see them as veterans. He saw them as people, with lives outside of their service. And when he saw the woman from the courthouse again, it was in the most unexpected place, a small coffee shop where they both happened to stop at the same time. He recognized her immediately, even though she was dressed casually with a warm coat and a smile that didn't seem to hide anything. "Hey," Daniel said, walking up to her. "It's good to see you again." She looked up, her expression unreadable at first, but then she smiled. "Officer Daniels," she said. "I didn't expect to run into you here." He hesitated for a moment, then decided to go ahead with what he had been thinking. "I just wanted to say thank you for your forgiveness and for teaching me something I needed to learn." Her eyebrows raised slightly. "I didn't do much. I just told you the truth. The rest was up to you." Daniels nodded, knowing she was right. He had been the one to make the change. But hearing her words made him feel like it wasn't just his own journey. It was a shared one. "I think about what you said a lot," he continued. "About seeing people for who they really are. Not just the surface, not just the uniform, not just the assumptions. I've been trying to do better about that." She took a sip of her coffee and looked at him thoughtfully. "That's all any of us can do. We're not perfect, but we can try." Daniel smiled, feeling something inside him shift again. It wasn't that he was suddenly perfect or that everything had changed in an instant, but something inside him had awakened. A deeper understanding of the world around him, of the people in it. They talked for a few more minutes, about life, about the struggles of serving, and about the challenges of moving forward after such experiences. Daniels learned more about her than he had ever expected. He learned about the nights spent in hospital beds after returning from overseas, about the difficulty of adjusting to civilian life, and about how for some, the hardest battles were the ones that no one could see. When they parted ways, Daniels felt a deep sense of gratitude. He wasn't sure what exactly had changed in him, but he knew that he was different. The next morning, Daniels went back to work, but things were no longer the same. He was more patient with people, more willing to listen, more understanding of the situations that others were facing. Whether he was pulling someone over for speeding or assisting a motorist on the side of the road, he approached each moment with a sense of respect and care that he had never felt before. And when he did pull someone over, he took the time to ask them how their day was going. He learned that sometimes a simple conversation could make all the difference. Some people just needed someone to listen, someone to see them not as a violator or a problem, but as a person. In the end, Daniels learned the most important lesson of all, not just about what it means to be a good officer, but what it means to be a good person. He realized that every single person had a story, and if you were willing to take the time to listen, to really understand, you might just change their day and maybe even your own. And that, he knew, was a gift that was worth more than anything else he had learned in his career.